Hello, Tennessee Voices viewers and listeners. This is David Plazas, the Opinion and Engagement Director for the USA Today Network Tennessee and the Tennessean. Today, I have the pleasure of having as my guest Representative Gloria Johnson of Knoxville, who's going to be talking about the legislative session and also her Senate campaign. How are you doing today, Representative?
Doing well. Thank you so much for having me on. I'm trying to get centered over here. So.
No worries at all. No worries at all. We're recording on January 8th, the day before the session. So when viewers look at this, it'll just be hours before the session starts. But tell me a little bit about what you're expecting. And again, for those who have been under a rock, you are one of the Tennessee Three who you were nearly expelled just by one vote, but you were part of the three representatives who were demanding gun law reform back in the spring. And tell me from that context, how do you see the 2024 session unfolding?
Well, there was just discussion on House rules today, and that's a little concerning because there seems to be a serious move to silence dissent in the House. We saw that last year. I was hoping we could be more open and allow more debate and actually allow debate and discussion. And I think it's a disservice to Tennesseans when we can't do that. If you don't mind, I'd like to read a small paragraph out of Mason's manual of legislative procedure, something that pops up many times in this book. It is a fundamental rule of parliamentary practice governing all deliberative assemblies that the opportunity to deliberate and, if possible, convince their fellows is the right of the minority, which right they cannot be deprived of by the arbitrary will of the majority. And that is why we feel there is a problem in our legislature, that our right to speak up as the minority is being ignored. And we see in these new House rules, what appears to be the House rules based on what I've heard so far, it's a serious problem. And I don't know why my colleagues across the aisle are afraid to have a deep discussion on legislation. I'd like to give an example of one time in my insurance committee. The sponsor of the bill, he had a bill to take away transgender care from adults in Medicaid when it came to TennCare. And his argument was that there are some Tennesseans who disagree with that care, therefore it should not be paid for by Tennessee. And so in my response to him, I gave several examples of policies that Tennesseans pay for that everyone doesn't agree on. Just to say that, yes, that happens a lot. Vouchers is one of those. All Tennesseans don't agree for vouchers, but we are all paying for them. Mm-hmm. And, we're never going to get 100% on anything, that's for sure. So to say that's the reason we remove it, my argument being, well, we don't remove other things that people disagree on. And then I was gavelled down for being off the bill. I was absolutely on the argument. The only way to respond was to point out how his argument was inaccurate. Not only was I gavelled down in committee, but the chairman came to my office to talk about he's really trying, but I have to stay on the bill. I told him over and over I was on the sponsor's argument and just giving examples of why his argument was faulty. Mm-hmm. But yet I was gavelled down. And that's just one example of so many where we are called off the bill, but we're almost always on the argument. And
you brought up a really great point about the right to a minority to speak up. And you've taken in recent years, and you've been here far longer than I have, obviously, but a more confrontational tone toward the speaker. Why do you feel that you needed to do that in order to be heard?
Well, because we saw that we were silenced on gun violence. Our mics were cut, or we weren't called on, and we were not allowed during welcoming and honoring to acknowledge folks who were there. And so I am sent to Nashville by 70,000 voters in my district. And that is something that they called on me to speak to. And I was not allowed to do so. Some of my friends in education used to call me Little Miss Law and Order because I do like to follow the rules. I like to change them if I don't think they're fair, but I am usually a rule follower. But if I'm not allowed to represent the folks that sent me there, I will find a way to represent them. I'd like to do it inside the rules, but we can only do it if the rules are fair.
Mhm.
And,
Yeah,
and we know that they're not.
I know last spring, one of the columns that I wrote prior to the expulsion hearing of you and Representatives Pearson and Justin Jones was that if the legislature would try to expel you, it might empower you further. And it seems like that came true. Their expulsion hearing became a mechanism to bring more attention to you and to elevate your profile. How has that changed your life, your career, and so forth?
It hasn't changed my life or career. What it has done is demonstrated that we do not have a democratic process in place in the legislature. And the reality is, I am one who wants to follow the rules, but if the rules aren't fair, we've got to figure out a way to do our job successfully. And so, my wish, my desire is that when you have a legislative problem to solve, you write a piece of legislation that you think will solve the problem that is occurring. And so one would hope, the way I always thought as an educator when I taught history and taught government, is that we go there, write our legislation, and we debate the positives and negatives and possible consequences thoroughly, legislation, and then we take a vote on it. But I don't think there's ever been a time in any legislation that we've disagreed on where Democrats were allowed all the time they needed. And then when we object to the question being called, of course, we're voted down. I do remember when Beth Harwell was Speaker, I don't recall my microphone ever being cut, and I don't recall ever being not called on if my hand were raised. I do not recall that happening. This is new since I came back in 2019 with former Speaker Cassada and Speaker Sexton. I didn't feel this way at that time. And I really disagree with using civility as civility as an excuse or a reason. If we disagree, we're not civil. Mm-hmm. You know what? Their policy is, quite frankly, not civil. Their policy in many ways is actually violent. We are talking about policies that they bring policies that harm women and girls. They deny health care to working families. They are neglecting or ignoring solutions to gun violence crisis and actively fueling the crisis by repealing gun safety laws. They're neglecting and ignoring child care deserts. They're neglecting and ignoring affordable housing. There's nothing civil about dismantling public schools and stealing public funds to subsidize private schools for the wealthy. There's nothing civil about banning books and teaching and denying the teaching of honest history. There's nothing civil about refusing our federal tax dollars for special ed and equity and breakfast and lunch for kids who desperately need it. There's no civility in punishing low-income workers, blocking an increase to minimum wage, and denying workers' rights, undermining voting rights, and giving predatory lenders so much power over citizens. These policies aren't civil. I don't raise my voice. I don't yell and shout or demean people in the building. I never do that. I raised my voice one time when my mic was cut and said, reclaiming my time pretty darn loudly. Yes, I did. That was one time when my mic was cut, and I really had an important last sentence to my argument that had gone beyond my 5 minutes, which wasn't all my 5 minutes. It was also the sponsor of the bill taking up a large portion of my 5 minutes. So, let's be honest about what's happening there and what civility really is, because I am always respectful. I will call you out when you lie. I will call you out when you bring policy that I think hurts Tennesseans. I absolutely will. But I don't attack on personal issues. I don't go after that kind of thing. But I think one thing I learned under the presidency of Donald Trump, if we don't call them out when they lie and when they are bringing policy that hurt people, it's a huge mistake. We have to call that out.
And I so appreciate you talking about those definitions, because for this case, I know I've been deemed as the civility person, but I agree with you wholeheartedly that civility is not about doing violence to people or hurting people or using violence, for example, of either the physical kind or the legislative kind. I recently got dinged for mentioning that related to Nashville's governance. But I wanted to turn for a moment to your Senate campaign. You launched your bid a few months ago. And what was interesting is that immediately the incumbent Senator, Marsha Blackburn, took notice, shall we say, and even though you're not officially yet the nominee for the Democratic Party, tell me a little bit about that process, and was that surreal, and how have you dealt with being in this race?
Well, it's a lot of work. A statewide race is way different than a legislative race, but that's okay. I hammered this out with friends and confidants about what that statewide race really looks like. And I had to really commit to it, understand I know what it takes, and I'm willing to do it. As soon as session's out, we are launching a 95 county tour that we're going to complete in a little over a month. We're serious about this. People are concerned about the economy. They're concerned about their ability to pay for the things that they need to pay for to support their families. And so this campaign is about making sure that we are raising wages for family and lowering costs for families, not lowering costs for corporations and billionaires, but we need to be cutting costs for regular Tennesseans who are struggling and concerned. Can I pay the grocery bill and our prescription bill this month? And then we've got people like my opponent who voted against capping the price of insulin. There's a high incidence of diabetes in Tennessee, and you're telling Tennessee families you're voting against capping the cost of insulin? Wow.
One of the interesting things that I've noticed as well last year was the conversations about democracy. You've brought this up quite a bit over the last few years. Ann Applebaum wrote in The Atlantic about whether or not Tennessee is a democratic state anymore, which famously got around internationally as she writes about authoritarianism globally. And aside from the question of whether or not she is correct, I am curious, what would be your prescription to reversing any effects on the Democratic Republic that we have and on this state?
Well, that's a massive undertaking, quite frankly. Certainly, we need to reinstate voting rights, and the H1 that is in Congress. We need to get rid of the voter suppression legislation that we passed in Tennessee. We need to make sure that we are allowing full debate on all issues. Some people like to forget that probably 80 to 85% of the time, Democrats and Republicans vote together on the vast majority of legislation. Where we come to disagree when it's legislation that doesn't help Tennessee families, doesn't improve their lives, doesn't lift people out of poverty, and lifting them into the middle class instead of having people fall out of the middle class. That's where we come to disagreement. But the vast majority of time, we vote the same on much legislation. I co-sponsor Republican legislation that I think helps people. You know, I'm willing to come to the table, but how come they're not willing to come to the table on gun sense legislation that 80% or 70% of Tennesseans want? Medicaid expansion that the vast majority of Tennesseans want. How come we're always uncivil because we're not coming to the table on their legislation that harms Tennesseans? We want to come to the table. We want them to come to the table on legislation that lifts Tennesseans, like cutting the grocery tax. My colleague, Representative Bain, is going to bring. I imagine we'll all support that. But we're about policy that lifts up Tennessee's hardworking families and not divisive culture wars and things that really don't affect the lives of most Tennesseans.
I'm curious about another local issue. I've covered the issue of housing for a long, long time, and I've been particularly interested in the Knoxville market. We've had a lot of writing about the cost of rent and the cost of housing in general. What are some of the things you're hearing from your community, and what government might do to solve this?
Well, here's the problem. We had a situation, and actually quite a bit of apartment complexes in my district, where people who had lived in these apartments for 7 years, rent went up reasonable amount, goes up $50 or maybe sometimes $100 after a couple of years. But we had a situation where people who were paying $850 a month got their rent changed to $1,600 a month. Many of these were folks living on a fixed income. How in the world do you expect people to make that sort of a jump? And so when it comes to fixing that situation, unfortunately, the state legislature ties the hands of your cities and counties who may want to put in some sort of protections for folks on fixed incomes and for rent being raised this much. But it's preemption from the state that is holding them back from creating solutions. And so it's very unfortunate that my colleagues across the aisle will talk about small government and in the same breath preempting locals from doing what they need to do to help the families in their city or county.
Representative Johnson, I'm very glad to have you here on the program. We're kicking off the Tennessee Voices Video Podcast 2024 session. This is actually episode 387. So I've been so delighted to talk to thinkers, leaders, makers across the state. And we have a few minutes left, but I'd love to ask you a little bit about your pitch to Tennessee voters in terms of why you as the next U.S. Senator.
And I think that what that pitch is I am listening to the families in Tennessee. I'm listening to the fact that a majority of them want to make sure our communities are safer, that the majority of them want to make sure that women have reproductive justice and women are considered equal in this state. I'm listening to them about their concerns of the economy and inflation, and I'm promising to act on making sure that we have a wage that families can live, and not just live and get by, but thrive on. And making sure that when we lower cost and when we lower taxes, we're not lowering them for billionaires and corporations. We're lowering them for hardworking families.
I want to thank you very much. And before we let you go, what are ways that people can connect with you and contact you if they want to learn more about you and get to know you?
Absolutely. You can, my website is votegloriajohnson.com. I'm Vote Gloria J on Twitter, Facebook, State Representative Gloria Johnson, and Instagram, Vote Gloria J. So I try to respond as much as I can to all of those. It's going to get kind of crazy. So, one of the best ways to reach me is votegloriajohnson@gmail.com. So lots of ways to get there. I'm slower than I used to be because I'm really slammed, but I'm going to get back to you.
Thank you very much, Representative Johnson. Best of success to you this session and in your future pursuits.
Thank you so much. I appreciate being on.